ちは。ジャーナリストの堀潤です。
はい、皆さんこんばんは。時刻は8時を回りました。毎月1回お送りしています月刊 WFP、国連の食糧計画、世界中のさまざまな貧困地域や紛争、飢餓、そうした状況にあえいでいる現場に食料を届ける活動、昨年はノーベル平和賞も受賞しましたが、この数年の間で飢餓人口は増加に転じていて、コロナもあり、さらには今日お届けするアフガニスタンやミャンマー、などでは非常に厳しい食料事情というのが伝わってきています。日本では今日から衆院選公示ということで、もちろん国家の役割として外交安全保障というのも関わってきますし、民主国家として人道支援というのをこれからどのような形で続けていくのか、日本の私たちの税金を原資にした ODA で国際社会にどう貢献していくのか、私たちが考えるべきテーマの一つでもあります。僕自身どうしてこの WFP の皆さんと一緒に発信を始めたかというと、やはり国内のニュースがエントリーされること多いんですよね、ニュース番組で。皆さんの関心事ということでしょう。ただ一方でそればっかりでいいのかと、国際情勢、諸外国の状況っていうことについてもっともっと感度を高める必要があるんじゃないかなと。でもおそらく感度高い方は大勢いらっしゃるんだけども、やってないじゃんっていう声もあると思うんですよね。確かにテレビのニュースを見た時にどれだけ国際情報を潤沢にやれているかっていうと、特に地上波のニュース番組では非常に厳しい状況だと思います。なのでぜひ国際情勢、しかも一時情報で皆さんに触れ合ってほしいなという思いで WFP、 まさに現地の最前線で活動している方々の声をお届けしております。8ビットニュースでは衆院選が始まる直前からハッシュタグ私の声を聞いてというものを作って、まさに現地の聞くべき声を届けています。これからさらに毎晩のように強化してお伝えしていきたいなと思っています。つい僕も先ほどまで藤沢におりまして、藤沢でダウン症の子どもたちを専門に預かる療育施設の取材だったんですけれども、こちらも私の声を聞いてというお父さんお母さんたちの声でした。さあ皆さん、今世界中の飢餓の状況、貧困の状況にどれだけ皆さんの知識が追いついているでしょうか。今日も現地で活動されている最新の映像情報をお届けしていきます。すでにインタビューしています WFP のアジアを担当されている責任者の方、お話を伺いました。ご覧ください、どうぞ。
Thank you very much for your time. First of all, could you please introduce yourself to our viewers?
Sure. Thank you very much, Kunjun. And it's very nice to be here with you today. My name is John Aliff. I'm the Regional Director for WFP in the Asia and Pacific region. And I'm based here in Bangkok, but WFP covers 16 countries across the region and has a portfolio of development and humanitarian projects, including in the countries you mentioned, but in 14 other countries as well.
First of all, please tell us what kind of problems the citizens are facing now in Afghanistan.
Well, Afghanistan, I think, is in the midst or in the grips of a humanitarian crisis of quite immense proportions. That crisis is magnifying every single day. We all watched in mid-August the scenes at the airport in Kabul around the 15th and in the days following that, graphic pictures of despair and desperation as people tried to leave the country, and pain, I think, that's unimaginable to many of us. But away from the airport, where the TV cameras weren't, what we discerned, what we saw was a country engulfed by sadness, actually, by sadness and a veil of fear and abandonment that the population felt as the international community, most of them left, and they were left behind in particular, facing immense hunger. And I'd like to just sort of set the scene a little bit, if you'll allow me. We need to start by really understanding that the hunger situation in Afghanistan was desperate even before the Taliban took over the country in August. We're talking here about a country ravaged by war for the last 20 years, an economy which has been destroyed, people that have really struggled to get daily work, an economy which, not just in the country's cities, but also in many of the rural areas, has not worked very well because of conflict. On top of that, we need to say that COVID-19 was devastating for the country. I remember back in 2020, about 30 million people, 75% of that, sorry, 10 million people, around 30% of the country's population was affected by COVID-19. And that was only the first wave. Since then, we've had 2 more waves of COVID, including this year in 2021, a 3rd wave. And these have really, again, disrupted economic life and made it very difficult for the average Afghan citizen, the average Afghan family, to feed themselves. Over 90% of the population lives on $2 or less a day. And to make things worse in 2021, as if that wasn't enough, we've had a drought, and it's been a very serious drought. About 40% of Afghanistan's wheat crop has been lost, and wheat is the staple food for the Afghan population. And so a combination of drought, COVID, and conflict we are distributing in this manner. And so, again, as I said, we have never stopped our COVID-19. And that was only the first wave. Since then, we've had 2 more waves of COVID, including this year in 2021, a 3rd wave. And these have really, again, disrupted economic life and made it very difficult for the average Afghan citizen, the average Afghan family, to feed themselves. Over 90% of the population lives on $2 or less a day. And to make things worse in 2021, as if that wasn't enough, we've had a drought, and it's been a very serious drought. About 40% of Afghanistan's wheat crop has been lost, and wheat is the staple food for the Afghan population. And so a combination of drought, COVID, and conflict has really left Afghanistan in a desperate situation even before the Taliban took over the country in August. Earlier this year, WFP estimated that 14 million people would need us, WFP, to feed them this year in Afghanistan. That's 1/3 of the population. And what we were particularly worried about even before the takeover was malnourished children. So 2 million children in Afghanistan, we knew they would need our help this year. And a malnourished child is in a life-threatening situation. And so if WFP and its partners do not reach these children now, we fear that many of them will simply die. So it's a desperate situation. WFP is still on the ground and never left the country, actually. But we are desperate to scale up our operations now in response to a much worsening situation.
Yeah, I heard that under the Taliban regime, the activities of the United Nations have been restricted. Has this created any problems for the WFP?
Well, luckily for WFP, we've been operating for some years in areas which were controlled by the Taliban. These have been the remote rural areas in the country. And so we are familiar with working with the Taliban. We had a set of relationships with the Taliban prior to their takeover, which helped us to continue, even in the month of August and even after the takeover, to access the population. So for us, we've continued. So far this year, we have reached 7 million people with food assistance. And our operations at the moment, thankfully, are continuing without many restrictions from the Taliban.
Yeah, thank you. This picture, what's the situation?
What this shows is firstly one of our warehouses. And so across the country, we have a network of warehouses. At the moment, we are between now and the end of the year, we'll be putting 200,000 tons of food into these warehouses. Warehouses are temporary storage. And from those warehouses, as you can see in the picture, people carry food to distribution sites. And in the picture below, you see a World Food Programme distribution of food and other essential items taking place. And across the whole country today, we are distributing in this manner. And so, again, as I said, we have never stopped. Our team stayed in the country. We bought hundreds of thousands of tons into the country this year already. And we are doing everything we can to get that food out to people who are desperate and increasingly hungry. As you can imagine, this is an amazing logistical challenge for us. We are bringing in food through all of the neighboring countries, Pakistan, Tajikistan. We're trying to buy food now in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. And so we've got multiple routes into Afghanistan, and we're using every single one of those to get food in. But in the country, as you can imagine, it's not simple to get around Afghanistan. And so we use commercial trucks, but WFP also has its own trucking fleet, and that trucking fleet is approximately 200 trucks with WFP markings that travel all around the country to some of the places most hard to get to. And we use those trucks to get food to distribution sites like the one you see in this picture.
Thank you very much. UNHAS is very important role of WFP. Please explain about UNHAS.
UNHAS stands for the UN Humanitarian Air Service, and it's a fleet of aircraft globally, actually, which fly humanitarian workers into places where commercial aircraft will not go. So we fly into war zones and into small airstrips across countries which are very, very hard to reach and where commercial flights do not go. Taking the example of Afghanistan, we in 2020, we flew 25,000 people, 25,000 passengers from about 170 organizations working in Afghanistan to 20 locations inside the country. When the Taliban took over, you may remember seeing on the news the population breached the perimeter of Kabul airport. And in that airport, WFP had 4 or 5 aircraft and 1 helicopter. Unfortunately, some of our aircraft were damaged at that time. However, we flew them to Pakistan, we brought other aircraft, and now we are running our air services from Pakistan into Kabul, and from Kabul then to an increasing number of locations around the country. The purpose of this is to ensure that humanitarian workers can get to the places where they need to work. And so UNHAS, which is operated by WFP on behalf of the broader humanitarian community, is an absolutely essential part of the services which WFP provides in Afghanistan today.
And next, please tell us about your support in Myanmar.
Thank you. I'd like to say for Myanmar that it's been quite a difficult year for humanitarian operators in Myanmar. But first of all, and first and foremost, it's been a very, very difficult year for the Myanmar population. So as you'll recall, there was a coup on the 1st of February in which the military took over from the democratically elected government. And since then, the crisis in Myanmar has become much more complex. Unfortunately, its violence has become much more entrenched, and the prospects for Myanmar, and certainly for food security, have become increasingly bleak. From WFP's perspective in Myanmar this year, hunger is rising, and unfortunately, hunger is rising very quickly. A bit like Afghanistan, I'd like to make the point that before the coup on 1st of February 2021, food security and poverty were already rising, and they were rising because of COVID. We saw emerging already a desperate situation for households. We carried out surveys which showed that COVID had really impacted food security, and our partners carried out analyses which showed that poverty had even gone up, almost doubled in 2020. This was because families lost their jobs because of COVID. Families could not move because of COVID lockdowns. And while this is a story which many countries faced in Asia, in Myanmar it was particularly serious. COVID really made an impact. On top of that, then we had the coup, and let me just describe a little bit how the coup has affected food security in Myanmar. We see a new face of hunger, and the new face of hunger is still rural, but it is increasingly urban. That new face of hunger is increasingly urban in Myanmar. Urban citizens who lost their jobs, who couldn't work because of protests on the streets of Myanmar's major cities, something we saw on the news across the last months, through disrupted economic activity. We've carried out surveys in the last months in Myanmar, surveys in which we talked to the population, we analyzed their food needs. And those surveys reveal that 60 to 80% of Myanmar's families today are struggling with reduced income levels and struggling to feed themselves. 90% of them are having to borrow money or take food on credit in order to feed their families, and yet half of those families have been forced to reduce food intake, to reduce the amount of food that they eat. And so we are very, very worried at the moment. Already earlier this year, around May, WFP predicted, as we saw the urban hunger rising, we predicted that an additional 3.4 million people in Myanmar were food insecure. And that meant at the time that 10% of Myanmar's population was food insecure. What we're seeing now is the situation, because of the protracted crisis and some of the factors that I'll come on to talk about, particularly the conflict, we're seeing now that that situation is deteriorating quite rapidly and will get worse in the weeks to come. So we've seen this first chapter of worsening food security, but we really think that things are going to get bad. Just looking at the slide there, if I may, we're seeing new needs arising, and so we've seen new displaced people, and more than 200,000 people have been displaced since February. What does that mean? It means that because of new fighting, intensification of fighting in the military, and some of the ethnic armed organizations, or some of the groups that have just emerged in opposition to the military, that new fighting has caused more than 200,000 people to move from their homes. Already in Myanmar, as you see from the slide, WFP was feeding 360,000 people in conflict-affected areas. These are areas that have been affected by conflict, some of them for many years. And these are populations that are in camps or have been really restricted from working. And those people depend almost entirely on WFP's food, the food we give them every month. And 360,000 of them we've been helping for years, actually. And we've sustained that through this period. It's been very challenging, but we've sustained our support to them. I should mention, because we are coming on to talk about Bangladesh, I should mention that quite a high proportion of that 360,000 are Rohingya, the Rohingya population, those who stayed behind in Myanmar, those who did not become refugees in Bangladesh. And so that population in particular is vulnerable, and we will need to continue fighting for them. If we could just go back in the slides to Myanmar would be great. Thank you. In Myanmar, WFP, if we could go back to Myanmar on the slides, I'd appreciate it. In Myanmar, WFP is one of the largest aid agencies on the ground. Generally, we feed about 1 million people every year with humanitarian work. We feed malnourished children. We do school feeding, feeding within schools, which encourages children to come to school. And we try to build the resilience of the population. Myanmar is prone to natural disasters, floods, cyclones, and we try and work with communities to make sure that when those disasters strike, they are more ready to withhold and withstand those crises. But I would say that now we're entering a critical period. WFP is responding with a new program in urban areas, but we're just not very well funded. And so we're trying to reach 2 million people, very, very poor people in places like Yangon and Mandalay and some of the other big cities of Myanmar. We've been unable to reach them because we don't have enough funding. We've reached roughly half of those. And the new displaced, the 200,000, we cannot gain access to them. We can't get in to those conflict areas to feed them. And so we're very, very concerned that humanitarian access is being restricted, that we're not getting the access that we need.
The people facing the more serious situation.
We've we fundamentally agree with you. And I think what we're going to see in the coming months is an increase in hunger, an increase in malnutrition, because this crisis is not going away. And so at WFP, as we enter this new period of rising hunger, we need three things. The first is all parties to this conflict must respect humanitarian law and facilitate our access. We must get in to feed people who have had to flee from their homes, but have no means to sustain themselves and no means to feed their families anymore. We must be granted access. The second thing we need is funding. It's amazing that in spite of the prominence of this crisis in international media, more funding has not flown and been put into Myanmar. What we've seen, of course, naturally, is development funding has stopped because development donors naturally do not want to continue supporting a government which is not a legitimate government, as we say. But what we need is an uptick, an increase in humanitarian funding. And the third thing, of course, we need is a political solution. And so we are backing and hoping very much for a political solution to this crisis, which will allow Myanmar's economy to get back on track and therefore hunger to be brought under control.
မိသားစု၄ယောက်ရှိတယ်။ကြီးကောင်က6နှစ်ငယ်မလေးက2နှစ်။အရင်ကအဲ့လိုပင်ရလောက်ပါတယ်။ပင်ရလောက်ကူကပင်ရလုံငန်းအဲ့လိုရတာကမှဟိုလိုမျိုးလောက်ကမကောင်းတဲ့ကောင်မျိုးကျတော့ကိုကြားပေါက်လေးပေါ့ဟိုရတီရအဲ့လိုလေးလိုက်လို့ဆို။ဟိုကြီးတာတော့အကုန်လုံးဈေးကြီးอ่ะအကုန်လုံးကတော့စတော့ဆိုစီတဘူးကို1000ပဲရှိတယ်။အခု2300ဆန်နေပါရတယ်ဆန်ဝေထားရရှိတယ်အားလေးစားရတယ်ကစုံနဲ့ခုမှဆိုကစုံနဲ့တော့ကိုစားရဘာမှမရှိရတော့ကစုံလေးကိုစားရတယ်ဘာမှမကူနိုင်ဘူးရှင်လေအိမ်မှာရှိရတယ်ကိုကစီဒီဆန်နဲ့ကလေးပဲကျွေးလိုက်တယ်ဒါအဆိုးဆုံးပါပဲအခုကြုံတွေ့နေကိုအဆိုးဆုံးကျန်တဲ့လူကတော့ဒီနားပေါဝင်နေတော်တော်များတော့အဆင်မပြေဘူးအဲ့လိုမျိုးမရှိတဲ့ချိန်ကြရင်တော့ညတာစားရတာပဲထမင်းတစ်ပကံရရတကားမှအဲ့လိုကစုံကကူပြီးတော့ဆက်တာလို့ဒီနေ့ရင်တော့ဒိုးစားလောက်တာလို့တကားမရှိဘူးဟိုတီရှင်တွေမှာတော့အဲ့လိုလိုက်လို့ဘူးပေါ့ဘယ်လိုမဆက်တော့ဘူးမိသားစုတော့ဆိုလို့တော့ဒိတ်ထက်လှူနိုင်အောင်စူတောက်ပေးပါတယ်ညာတိုင်းလည်းဖះရှိခိုးပြီးတော့ဒီလိုလာပြီးတော့လှူပေးတဲ့အတွက်လည်းအဲ့နေတော့ဆိုတော့မျက်ရည်တောင်ကျတယ်တကယ်ဖះဆိုလာမေးပြီးနှီးခင်းကြောကြလိုက်စင်းစားပြီးတော့စိတ်ထဲမကောင်းဝမ်းလဲဝမ်းသာပြီးတော့မျက်ရည်တောင်ကျတယ်အဲ့နေတော့
Please tell us about the Rohingya and the minority people in Bangladesh.
Thank you for asking about Bangladesh. It still remains one of the most critical parts of our regional program. There are 860,000 refugees in the Cox's Bazar districts of Bangladesh. And I was thinking back earlier to when this happened, 2017. I was country director in Bangladesh about a decade ago, and we had Rohingya refugees, but there were 30,000 of them. And in 2017, within the space of just a few days, about 900,000 or 1 million people just came across the border in one flood of people. And WFP was on the ground with its partners trying to respond and start feeding these people almost overnight. I think we need to pay tribute to the government of Bangladesh for hosting about nearly 900,000 refugees in one of the most poor areas of Bangladesh. And so we are feeding these people every day. We're doing it with one of the most innovative methods that I've seen in my 30 years in the World Food Programme. In the past, we used to just give food to beneficiaries once a month, and they used to queue up once a month, get the bags of food, and they used to take them back to their refugee shelters, and then a month later they would come back. We've completely revolutionized that in Bangladesh. WFP has built 22 shopping centers, actually, 22 supermarkets. And in addition to those 22 supermarkets, we've got 15 outlets providing fresh foods. The refugees, they get like a credit card. It's like a debit card, actually. A plastic card, which has their name and their fingerprint in there. And every month we charge that up with money, and they go shopping in the supermarket which we built. This is a whole new way of doing business, but it means so much more dignity for refugees. And so those 860,000 people, every single family within them uses the system of the debit card and going to the supermarket. And WFP has created this from scratch in the last 4 years. What this does is help the refugees. It gives them, there are more than 20 food items they can choose from, dried fish, fresh foods, but it does more things than that. We buy that fresh food from the local economies, from local farmers, and those local farmers benefit from providing fresh foods to the camps. And overall, if you look at how much money is injected into the local economy, it's about $11 million a year through employing people and paying them in cash, as well as buying local produce for distribution in the refugee camps. So this is a new type of thing. It's very important that we feed people in the local community as well. And so we have a school feeding program for them. And we've done a whole host of programs which benefit the local community, because that local community has ultimately been incredibly generous in welcoming and hosting so many refugees.
Nearly 900,000 Rohingya live in camps in Bangladesh, with the main camp hosting 600,000 people in just 13 square kilometers, which is the population of Washington, D.C., in an area 1/8 the size. The Rohingya are an ethnic minority who have faced decades of repression, persecution, and violence in Myanmar. On the 25th of August 2017, over 700,000 Rohingya crossed into Cox's Bazar, many with young children. They have since been living in the world's largest and most crowded refugee camp. Built on land that used to be a national park, bamboo and tarpaulin shelters cover the landscape, many of them perched on hillsides. The camps we see today are much more established. Out of $1 billion spent on the humanitarian operation, the World Food Programme alone spends 1/3, $300 million every year, with the monthly assistance package valued at over $13 an individual. This video will show you some of the transformational change that has been possible through the hard work of humanitarian partners and the Rohingya themselves. WFP delivers food to the entire Rohingya population in Cox's Bazar. The introduction of electronic vouchers has transformed the way they receive this food. The Rohingya use a WFP assistance card topped up with $11 a month, which can be redeemed at outlets run by local retailers in the camps. Families can choose to spend their money on fresh vegetables as well as eggs and dried fish, while local producers have a steady market. To enhance nutrition while also helping local farmers, WFP has set up fresh food corners offering vegetables in e-voucher outlets and piloted farmers markets for farmers to sell their produce directly to the Rohingya. Here you see a beneficiary classified as an extremely vulnerable individual, or EVI. This is the final step of the food distribution process, where we ensure that beneficiaries are claiming the correct allocation of food determined by the number of people in her household. As she is an EVI, the beneficiary will return home using the porter service, with food delivered to her door. While schools were closed during COVID-19, fortified biscuits previously provided as nutrition supplements in school were given out at e-voucher outlets in the camps. This is an integrated nutrition center run by WFP and UNICEF for children and women struggling with moderate and severe malnutrition. 45 integrated nutrition centers serve 200,000 women and children every month. As part of the Self-Reliance Program in 2020, 27,000 Rohingya were engaged in income-generating activities, such as vegetable production, aquaculture, and tailoring. During the pandemic, 150 women produced 700,000 reusable face masks for the camps and host communities. A recycling pilot collected, cleaned, and recycled over 300,000 aluminium-based packets and bottles. As the world tries to find its way out of the COVID-19 crisis, the Rohingya continue to face an uncertain future. The humanitarian community stands as committed as ever to providing a life of dignity and keeping their story alive in people's minds.
And emergency preparedness please mention about it.
Yeah, I mean, what we have to recognize is that this part of Bangladesh in which they live, like many parts of Bangladesh actually, is very prone to disasters. And so disasters strike almost every year. We have cyclones, and the cyclones come in the Bay of Bengal, and they devastate the landscape. And we have landslides. There's when a lot of rain comes, there are landslides. When there are fewer trees, mudslides come. Recently also, we've had fires within the camps. And so this is a disaster-prone area. WFP wants to give something back to the communities. And so we've invested with our engineers in certain projects, some of which you see covered here. In the Cox's Bazar district, first of all, there are cyclone shelters. When the cyclone's coming, the population all go to a cyclone shelter. This is a reinforced building above the land, which can withstand wind and storm surge. So water, waves of water coming through, surges of water, small floods, and heavy winds. And WFP has rehabilitated some of those 70 of those cyclone shelters. We've also made them accessible for disabled people, so that disabled people are not left behind. We've also planted trees, about 330,000 trees, and we work with the host communities to maintain those. Those are so important because you can imagine how many trees are cut down by the host population for firewood, and originally also by the refugees. So we're giving back and helping the environment by planting trees. We run a massive engineering operation. The camp that I talked about, the largest one in the world, it's like a small city. And so WFP and two other UN agencies, we run an engineering service where we employ 50,000 volunteers, and those volunteers help build the roads, maintain the roads in the camps, which we've built, maintain the slopes, make sure that there's no flooding. And these camps are some of the best I've seen because of that engineering work, but we couldn't do that without refugee volunteers and volunteers from the host community that help us. Just on emergency response again, I mentioned the fires. We've had various problems in the camps. There was a devastating fire a few months ago, which burned down the refugee homes of so many. We've also had floods more recently. And so what WFP did was we put small warehouses across many areas of the camp, so that as soon as there was a disaster, we could open the warehouses and bring food to families who had lost their homes in the case of the fires. and also the floods. In the devastating fires and floods of 2021, WFP also switched immediately to providing hot meals, hot cooked meals for refugees, as you see, for 1.1 million of them, because the refugees had lost their homes and therefore lost the ability to cook for themselves. So for short periods, we rush in and provide cooked meals as well. And so activities are so critical because Bangladesh is so affected by disasters, by natural disasters.
Yeah. I think that there is not much information disseminated about the situation of ethnic minorities. Do you have any request to the mass media?
Thank you for raising that, June. It's critically important. And when you look at Asia, there's a lot of inequality, and that there's a lot of income inequality. There's a lot of inequality, gender inequality, but there's also inequality which disfavors the ethnic minorities. And I'm so glad to see you raise that. We would love the international media to cover the plight of some of the ethnic minorities more than they do today. It's a challenge because take a crisis like Afghanistan, which we've talked about. So 14 million people need food this year. It's easy when you get a huge number like that to just look at the big picture, and looking at the big picture is also important. But within that community, we've got ethnic minorities who were poorer than everyone else to start with, and who at the World Food Programme we take particular care of during this time. It is important for us to cover their needs as well. We have some countries, Laos is one of them, where there are huge, immense numbers of ethnic minorities, all living with different issues, different languages, very hard for them to integrate economically, and they face challenges. But I would say, picking up on our conversation, that one of the most unfortunate and forgotten ethnic minorities in the world today are the Rohingya. And there are many ethnic minorities that we need to pay attention to, but my heart goes out to the Rohingya in particular. I have said many times that that humanity and history will judge us all as an international community, as a world community. We will be judged, and history will judge us on what we did for the Rohingya in these years of crisis, where 860,000 of them are living in Bangladesh. There are 600,000 left in Myanmar, by the way, still. And we see stories, which we're grateful that the media covers, by the way. We see stories of them trying to escape by boat. Often that ends tragically, but no one wants them. And that is heartbreaking. And so my plea then is for the media to cover ethnic minorities more generally, to try and get below those big numbers and look at the plight of ethnic minorities. But my plea in particular, at this particular moment in our history of the world, is really for the Rohingya.
Thank you very much. Afghanistan and Myanmar are countries that have a close relationship with Japan. However, I think that there are not enough voices of solidarity from the citizens. What do you expect from each and every Japanese person?
Well, I would slightly disagree with you, if I may, because actually Japan, for us in WFP, not only is a global donor, a very key global donor for the World Food Programme across the world, across the many crises we face, but actually in Asia is particularly an important donor for us. Let's take Afghanistan, for example. Japan has been with us for decades, literally, providing a lot of support for Afghanistan, particularly during the most crises, the most critical years of Afghanistan's history. This year, I should say, in 2021, WFP put out an appeal a particular appeal for 2021. We knew the needs would be high. And the first donor in 2021 to respond was Japan, who provided $12.9 million as early as January. And so we're particularly grateful. But across the other programs that we've talked about today, Myanmar and Bangladesh, Japan has been a critical donor. The urban program in Myanmar, the one that was so important to start this year, the first donor to that was Japan. So that is your government. But I know that your government is also the Parliament of Japan is also very engaged. I personally had the great pleasure to meet the Parliamentary League of Japan, the one that supports WFP. They have visited Cox's Bazar, by the way, and visited the refugees, and they're extremely active. But those parliamentarians and your government represent the people of Japan, who have shown really undying generosity to the world's hungry. I'm very grateful for that. And let me take this opportunity really to thank, from the bottom of our hearts and on behalf of all the hungry people in Asia, to thank the Japanese people and the Japanese government.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, John-san. Please give us the message about Afghanistan and Myanmar, and there is so many people, they need help, helping. So please please give us your message.
There are many hungry people in this world today, and unfortunately, because of conflict and because of economic stagnation, which the COVID pandemic has brought, that number of people in the world who are hungry is rising. But my message is, I can't see any more desperate population in this world today than the ones in Afghanistan and Myanmar. The economic hardship is escalating and it's spiraling out of control. Hunger is rising at a rate that we've never seen in those countries. And so my message is, we must, as an international community, show solidarity with the people in those countries. Whatever we think of the politics of both governments is, for me, important, but we need to look beyond that. The humanitarian imperative is very strong. Hunger is rising. We must not let the children in those countries die of malnutrition. And the World Food Programme is there on the front lines responding, and we really appreciate both the world's attention to hunger, in those countries, but particularly your support through WFP.
Yeah, thank you very much. Interview has done. Thank you.
June, thanks so much. It's been a pleasure to meet you. I've been an admirer and heard a lot about you. I've watched your other interviews, and it's so nice to meet you. Once again, thank you very, very much for supporting hunger. Thank you for supporting WFP. We really appreciate it.
どういたしまして。ありがとうございました。
はい、皆さんいかがだったでしょうか。非常に貴重なインタビューでしたね。今コメントを見ていたら、僕がなかなか日本では関心が低いなということが実感なんですけど、どう思いますかって、代表に聞きましたら、いやそんなことはないんだと、いの一番に支援をよこしてくれたのは日本政府だったじゃないかと、議会などでも関心を持ってくれているのでしょうと、いう言葉がありました。確かに今外務省のねホームページ見てみたりとか、あとはもちろん WFP の活動報告のホームページにも、私たちが思っている以上にというか知らなかっただけなんだと思うんですけれども、ミャンマーの現状、アフガニスタンの現状、ロヒンギャ難民への支援などさまざまな形で、言ってるんです、物資や緊急支援が。でその原資はもちろん私たちの税金ですよね。私たちが本当にこの問題に対して一つ一つ、感度を持っていられるだろうかっていうことはもう一回問い直した方がいいと思っています。幸いにして日本の皆さんありがとうございますって言っていただきましたけれども、 僕はもう一人一人がもっともっと、もっともっとこう世の中のこうした情勢に対して関心を持ってアクションを取ってくれる人が増えればいいなと思っています。土田さんありがとうございます。スーパーチャットをね入れていただきました。いろんな本当に声が寄せられていて、僕も今スイッチングしながらコメントを書きながら皆さんのコメントを嬉しく見ておりました。軍事政権国の支援は現地の声を聞くと現地資金だけでは難しいことが多いのですね。そうなんです。貴重なお話ありがとうございました。マキさん、スーダンのように行きたい国になるように祈っています。そうですね。とにかく安心安全安定、そのためには食料、WFP の活動は非常に要です。マサイさん、日本人は地球市民としての自覚と責任がもっと必要でしょうねという声もいただいています。マイアクションチャンネルさん嬉しいですね。もっと勉強しなきゃ、もっと報道してほしい。その通りですよね。太田さん、堀さんこんばんは。この WFP の番組を視聴して先月駅前で WFP の方々がいられたのでお声をかけて支援の一員にしていただきました。WFP の方曰くユニセフさんと勘違いされるそうです。ユニセフも本当に必要なアクションを取っていますが、ぜひ皆さんこの WFP 世界食糧計画の活動に注目してください。街頭で募金を呼びかけている皆さん、 WFP の協会の皆さんですね。WFP の協会の皆さんが一義的には皆さんからのそうした寄付を集める窓口となっています。寄付をしても現地の政府に渡ってしまうだけなんじゃないんですかという話がありましたが、だからこそこうした国連の機関の活動というのが重要なんですよね。映像を見ていただいて分かるように WFP の皆さんがオペレーションを組んで現地の必要なところに直接食料を届けに行っています。過去のこの月刊 WFP のアーカイブをぜひご覧いただきたいんですが、本当にいろんな形で、航空機も使えます、ヘリコプターも使えます、水陸両用車も使えます、陸路も、そしてこう滑車のようなねトロッコのようなものを使って山あいの村に届けたりとか、もちろんこう人が届けるということもあります。いろんな形で直接人々に食料を届ける、飛行機の上空からね食料を下に落下させてっていうオペレーションも非常にWFP らしい取り組みですね。今日も VTR ありましたけども、アンハスというですね航空部門を運営しています。本当に心強いですね。ゆかりさんかな、ありがとうございます。スーパーチャットいただきました。マキさんもありがとうございます。新吉田さん、今日のプログラムをもっともっと拡散しましょう。嬉しいじゃないですか。ぜひねライブでこうして見てくださった方々に次にお願いしたいのはこうした報告の映像をですねシェアしていただいたりとか、いいねを押して、これ皆さんコメント書いてくれるじゃないですか。YouTube のアルゴリズム上ここにいろんなコメントがたくさんこう書き込まれるものっていうのは非常にこう活動が活発だということで、おすすめの動画にこう上げてくれたりとかするんですよね。なんで僕がこの WFP の活動をこういう形で8ビットニュースで発信しているかというと、本当に僕はスーダンに取材に行った時にアンハスの航空機に乗せてもらって、それがあったから現地に入ることができたんですね。シリア難民のキャンプに行っても子どもたちがね食料になかなかありつけない中、きちんと配布される食料を手にして、これは自分の分じゃなくて弟の分なんだって言って届けてあげている少年の様子とか、もう忘れられないんですよね。前回の WFP 月間 WFP ではイエメンの状況などもお伝えしましたが、 イエメンの状況も本当に気になってるんですが、もう日本人取材者がなかなか中に入ることさえままならないという状況から、さらにコロナで、移動が制限されてしまったということもあって本当に心配してたんですけれども、なんとそういう最前線でもこの中コロナ、WFP の活動が続いてきたということなんです。感度を維持するのは物理的に遠いと難しいね。常に気にかけてニュースを見ることは大切。これからもよろしくお願いします。という渡辺さん、嬉しいじゃないですか。ありがとうございます。次回もですね、計画しているんです。WFP、月刊 WFP の。今度は現地で活動している日本人の方に、ご登場いただこうと思っています。ライブでできるかな、ちょっとなかなか回線の都合で収録になるのかなというのはまた機会があれば皆さんにシェアできればなと思いますが、とにもかくにもこのようにして発信が続いていますので、ぜひ皆さんよろしくお願いします。たくさんのご視聴いただきましてありがとうございました。WFP の皆さんの活動をどんな風にしたら支えられるの、おすすめのアプリを毎回紹介しています。WFP の協会の方の皆さんがね運営しているこの開発した WFP のアプリがあります。シェアザミールというアプリです。シェアザミールというアプリです。これ本当によくできているアプリで、食料の支援が必要な地域ごとにこのようにめくっていくと現地の様子が映像付きでこのようにまとめられています。例えば、シリアの家族とシェアしよう、必要な1、10、100、1000万、10万、100万、220万食のうち187万4065食、85% まで現在来てますと、ここに対してこの寄付をする、今寄付をするというのを押すと、このように例えば自分でどれぐらいの金額を寄付するのかを選べるんです。でこれよくできてるなと思うのは、例えば85円って出てきましたよね。85円がこれ1食分、シリアの家族を支援しようという85円が1食分です。じゃあ1000円余りだとどうなのかなと、12食、皆さんのねその時々の経済事情、お財布事情に合わせて、もしくは日々ね、今日1食食べた分一緒に寄付しようとかね、僕もじゃあ今こちらに寄付します、50食分4250円、いきましょう。これアップルの僕の iPhone なんで、このようにこうカチカチっと Apple Pay で、もうできた。もうできたんじゃない？いいじゃないですか。ありがとうございましたという形でこんなに簡単に寄付ができます。今はたまたまシリアでしたけど、その他にもいろんな地域の方々の食料支援、ニカラグアの子どもたちに学校給食を届けようというのもありますね。ニカラグアの状況も僕はあんまりよく知らないからな、見てみよう。マダガスカル、そうか。こんな風にですね、このシェアザミールを見ているだけで世界中の状況などがいろんな情報として、伝わってきますので、これはもうぜひダウンロードしてみてください。ありがとうございました。ね、すごいデジタルでしょ？ではまた明日お会いしましょう。明日のこの時間は、倉持麟太郎さんのこのクソ素晴らしき世界の配信をお届けしております。私は、またちょっと現地の取材に行かなくてはならないところがありますので、また次回お会いしましょう。そうだ、22日、金曜日からは私の配信を毎晩のように定時でお届けしたいと思います。発表はまた後日。では衆院選、投開票まで私の声を聞いてしっかり伝えていきたいと思います。ではでは。